Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.
Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Today we examine critical aspects of what's increasingly being called the Adani scandal. And we ask the critical question, what went wrong? There are four aspects of the Adani scandal that I should examine today. They are the Hindenburg report and the Adani Group's response, the Adani Group's withdrawn FPO and the market response, the lack of response from Sebi and the central government, and then perhaps the critical question, what impact will this have on India as an investment destination? My guest is someone who knows the answers to this question perhaps better than anyone else. He's the former chairman of Sebi, the former chairman of UTI and IDBI Bank, and the present chairman of Indigo, M. Damodaran. Mr. Damodaran, when the Adani Group called off its FPO on Wednesday night, and said it was returning money to all subscribers, it claimed that this was the morally correct thing to do. Do you accept that they acted for moral reasons, or did they act because even after their FPO was fully subscribed, the market continued to tank, and in fact, Adani Enterprise lost pretty close to 30% the very next day? So did they act out of moral concerns, or did they act to deflect the market's attention and perhaps appease the market, which clearly was showing when the share price tanked that they believed Hindenburg, not the Adanis?
Thank you. First of all, let me make a prefatory statement that all that I'm going to tell you is based on what I've gathered from the media. I have no additional knowledge of what is happening or what happened earlier or why something happened. There is enough material out there in the media for us to interpret conceptually what happened. To your first question, why did they, after the FPO was fully subscribed, decide to withdraw that? I believe that the board of Adani Enterprises had a meeting which lasted late into the night. And the directors on the board felt that this was in investor interest to withdraw it because, as you said rightly, even after the FPO was subscribed, the shares continued to show a southern trend. They felt that this would be in the interest of investors. This is the reason why I understand that they pulled it. We want to call it a decision taken on moral grounds. I am not getting into the moral question because I don't think in many of these, some of these adjectives work. I think the real issue is that they suspected this would be, in the circumstances, a positive signal coming from the group and from the company itself to the investing community and to other stakeholders that, look, we have money, we don't need this money. My question, of course, is if you didn't need the money, why did you go and raise it in the first place? I think as far as that question is concerned, it was a decision that was taken by a meeting of directors on the board, and the Adani Group has a number of independent directors on the board. It lasted late into the night, I am told, and then they took this decision. So, more than that, I think we can't.
But you made a very important point. You said you're not going into the moral issues, but you believe that the real issue was they thought they needed to send a positive message to investors. And that, I think, is sufficient for those who can read between the lines. They will understand what you're saying. At this point, let us briefly go back into how this problem started. And can I first ask you, what is your assessment of what you know of the Hindenburg report? It's accused the Adani group of market manipulation and round tripping, what it calls, and I'm quoting, the largest con in corporate history. It also says that small-time auditors, some of whom are allegedly in their early 20s, have been auditing Adani accounts rather than major established firms. Do you believe that these charges, which on their own are extremely damning, are actually backed up by credible evidence and documentation, or are they just allegations and indeed lies, as the Adani CFO claimed? Which of the two?
I think the report, which is in excess of 400 pages or so, has a lot of detail, has a lot of information, but I have 2 or 3 questions. One, the timing. If this was, as some claim, a rehash of what was already known, what was in the public domain, and some of which even maybe agencies had looked at, regulatory agencies, the timing of this report on the eve of the FPO surely must raise some eyebrows, especially considering that it is coming from someone who is admittedly a short seller who had positions on this particular company which was doing the FPO. So some of this is old hat. The second is about the audit. I am not one of those who believes that the older you are necessarily wiser. You're certainly more experienced. That experience might not translate to wisdom. To say that unknown auditors, young auditors were auditing this raises one question, that the Big Four did have and continue to have issues in many jurisdictions on the quality of audits done by them. Many jurisdictions, not excluding India, where the NFRA has pulled up some of them and their partners. I think we need to look at the quality of audit rather than who did the audit. Now, what the Adani Group says, and I have no reason to disbelieve this, is the names of our auditors were already available in public domain. What is this new thing that they're coming up with saying these are unknown auditors? They were auditors, they have been auditors, and the fact that they're small auditors, I can tell you some other big companies that do not have the Big Four as their auditors, and their investors don't seem to be having any questions. So I don't want to take a position. The truth will emerge after inquiries, which I understand could be, will come out. But on the face of it, to say these are not the Big Four, and the group says some of our companies are audited by the Big Six, they say. I don't know where the Big Six came from, because we talk about the Big Four these days after the numbers 5 and 6 disappeared.
Yeah. I get the impression, Mr. Damodaran, that you're not very impressed either by the allegations raised by the Hindenburg report, nor are you terribly impressed by the concern they've raised about auditing. Am I right in that impression?
I think you are right when you say that I am not entirely convinced that on their own these allegations amount to much, because these particular allegations on who audited it, I would like to see the quality of audit. What in the audit is it that they believe was suboptimal, that did not reflect what investors know? And that I am not seeing in that report.
Let me raise a point about the timing. You felt that the timing was suspicious. Many people have made that comment as well. On the other hand, is it not also true that if Hindenburg is admittedly and saying so that they are short selling, then they will choose their timing to make the maximum impact, which is why they released the report 2 or 3 days before the FPO. From the Hindenburg point of view, it's not suspicious, it simply heightens the impact.
No, I didn't say suspicious. I said I'm a little curious about the fact that they chose to release this. Now, if this was information that was very valuable for the stakeholder community, and I'm going beyond investors, at all stakeholders, and you had this information which you believed was critical to an understanding of how these group companies were functioning, should you have held it back till the FPO was going to get started? Of course, they were admittedly short sellers. They were going to get money. Short selling is not something that is illegal. It exists in all markets. Regulators accept that short selling is a practice that has been there for a while. Whether that short selling is in a manner that gives rise to other questions is something regulators will look at. But the timing intrigued me really, that it was at this time that I'm not using the word suspicious. Clearly, you said they are short sellers. They will look at the timing which suits their interest. And maybe this was the best timing for them.
Now, I've asked you about your opinion of the Hindenburg report. In all fairness, I should also ask you about your opinion of the 413-page response from the Adani group. They accused Hindenburg of a malicious combination of selective misinformation and baseless and discredited allegations to drive an ulterior motive. Perhaps more importantly, the Adani rebuttal also claimed that this was not just an attack on the Adani group, but on India itself. Were you convinced either by the claim that Hindenburg is malicious and baseless, or by the claim that the Adanis were wrapping themselves in the national flag and saying, you're not just attacking us, you're attacking the country?
That is something that I don't buy into, that this was an attack on India and that, this group symbolized India. Well, they are large players in the infrastructure sector, they're significant players. They are a significant presence in the Indian economy across several sectors. But that said, there's not enough to point to this being an attack on India. I don't think, and India is very strong. It will, even if somebody thinks that this will hurt India, India will write this out before you know it. So I think that is something that you should just dismiss as unnecessary. But the Adani report, the response itself, firstly, if you recall, was a very brief response. Then I suspect in this day when test matches have become fashionable, somebody scored 400 plus runs, I will also score 400 plus runs. So you put out a very large detailed report. I would have liked to see that response being a little shorter, a little more focused, less verbiage, and yet addressing all the issues. And that could have been done, I imagine, by a good communications expert. The content of the response is, look, there are these 4 buckets in which these allegations lie. We're dealing with these bucket. They have gone into some of the details. Could this have come a little earlier, 2-3 days earlier, instead of the much shorter response that came earlier, which was seemingly dismissive of the report? Then you realize, the markets were taking it seriously, so you needed to come out with a detailed report. In these matters, I think timing is also of the essence. To hold yourself back, every day is all of 24 hours, and the market will read this differently.
You're making a very important point, and I'm quoting you. You say the response should have been shorter, more focused, less verbiage, and you're also suggesting that they should have brought out their response earlier in a more focused way, and they should have perhaps hired professional media people to phrase it more convincingly. That's a very important thing you said. I think the audience will note it. Let's come at this point to the second big issue I want to raise with you, which is the FPO, which is now withdrawn, and the manner in which the market responded to it. I think the manner of the market response is the more important thing. The Business Standard has said that domestic financial institutions and mutual funds did not buy a single share of the FPO. Separately, the Hindustan Times says that whilst roughly 50% of the issue was reserved for retail investors, they actually only bought 12%. What do those two facts tell you about the market response to the FPO? That domestic financial institutions and mutual funds did not buy a single share, and retail investors only bought 12% of the 50% allocation for them.
Let's take the retail investors first. I'm delighted that the retail investors did not jump into it immediately and say, okay, let's pick this up, because there was a large portion that was reserved for them, and yet they didn't pick it up. Because I would like to see over a period of time more informed investing taking place in the market. Clearly, they didn't have all the information they needed to make investment decisions, and therefore they decided in this kind of a situation where by the minute there are new developments being reported, let's stay back and not invest in. As for the mutual funds and the domestic institutions, I think they have been careful, because some of them, the mutual funds, have completely stayed away from this. And I think the mutual funds are in a situation where they have a stewardship role, and they are acting on behalf of smaller investors, and they need obviously to see that they take measured steps, that they take correct, well-informed steps. So I'm not surprised that this happened, that the response of the mutual funds, the domestic institutions, and the retail investors was less than what the company would have expected.
What you're saying, and I'm interpreting you and putting that interpretation back to you, when you say that you're delighted retail investors stayed back, and when you point out that mutual funds and domestic institutions have a stewardship role, they act on behalf of other retail investors, you're saying both parties, the retail party and domestic institutions and mutual funds, behaved responsibly.
I think they behaved responsibly largely because they would have, certainly the institutions would have liked to see more information, would have liked more clarity on what was happening, not go either by the report or by the response, take their own decisions, and they believed that they needed to do a little more due diligence before they took investment decisions, which is why they stayed back.
Now, the business standard says that over 60% of the shares were bought by what are called high net worth individuals. And Bloomberg separately has named two, Sajan Jindal and Sunil Mittal. The Economic Times says that one unnamed Delhi-based industrialist invested up to 1,200 crore. Doesn't this suggest that the FPO was bailed out by these high net worth individuals, some of whom possibly may also be friends of Mr. Adani, but if they hadn't bailed out the FPO, it would have collapsed?
So the numbers certainly show that what made the FPO sail through was the SNI investments. And these numbers are out there in the public domain. Why they took these investment decisions, they know best. Now, being a friend of somebody is not in itself an offense. Let's say that. I mean, today you can say you're somebody's friend, therefore, you're doing something wrong. I don't like that. In an area where people know everybody else, being friendly with a promoter who is in the situation is wrong. But this money didn't come from their company. This has come, I think, from family offices, from their own individual. The risk appetite might be high, much higher than a retail investor's risk appetite. Therefore, they could have thought, and surmised, I have no evidence, never been an HNI, therefore I cannot tell you what it feels like to take an HNI decision on this. But it's entirely possible that somebody thought this was a good economic decision. Things seem to have reached a level from which it could only get better. Therefore, if you have the ability to stay the course, you will see good rewards later. It's entirely possible. It's also possible, not ruling that out, that somebody could have reached out to them. It's not unknown in the market saying that, we need you to invest in this, but the call would have been there. So I don't want to be judgmental about this. I don't know enough.
Can I interrupt and ask you this? Do you think some of these high net worth individuals were brought under pressure by the government? Or do you rule that out? Or do you not want to speculate about it?
I think what happens in such situations is invariably somebody the other points a finger at whichever government, whichever ministry is in possession, and says, no, they must have been influenced. There was a time, I'm not discounting it, when issues were bailed out, but these were public sector issues, bailed out because of phone calls that emanated from Delhi, and reluctantly, some people, institutions largely, bailed out some of the, let's say, bank divestment issues, etc. Other institutions, again from the public,
Okay.
did chip in. I think, there is a pattern to this that every time something of this kind happens, if LIC takes a good commercial decision, I'm not saying all the decisions are good, but they take a good commercial decision, but it's significant, somebody will say they must have been instructed to do this. Because they are normally the whipping boys whenever something, because of their size. Right?
I understand.
I had no evidence to say that somebody from the government said you need to do this, arm twisted, etc. I have no evidence.
Let me come at this point, Mr. Damodaran, to two of the big concerns I want to raise with you specifically with your hat on as a former chairman of Sebi and a former chairman of UTI. I'll start with the lack of response from Sebi. Now, clearly, the market is deeply troubled by the serious questions raised about the Adani group. On the day the FPO was completed, Adani shares were 15% below what they were on January the 24th when the Hindenburg report came out. On Wednesday, Adani Enterprise fell nearly 30%. Yesterday, it fell a further 26.5%. Now, PSU banks, which are believed to have loaned money to Adani, are also seeing their shares falling, although by nowhere near as much. More importantly, Credit Suisse and Citibank have announced they will not accept Adani bonds as collateral. From the 7th of February, Dow Jones has announced that Adani will no longer be part of what's called their sustainability indices. And finally, the Norwegian oil fund has reduced its holding of Adani shares by 3/4. From 800 million, it's come down to 200 million. All over the world, there is concern. In India, there is concern. And yet there is total deafening silence from Sebi. How do you explain this as a former chairman of Sebi?
I don't think we should expect Sebi to conduct regulation in the marketplace so that everyone knows what they are doing. I've said this before in different contexts. It is entirely likely that Sebi has embarked on a process of investigation. They are reaching out to these newspapers, say that they've sought information from credit rating agencies. Reserve Bank of India has sought some information from the banks on what their exposure is to the various companies in this group. So what they will be doing in their offices, and they will not be obviously releasing things. I don't want to even suggest that it would be a good practice for Sebi to come out every evening, hold a press conference and say, this is what we are doing. They shouldn't do that. That's not how regulation ought to be conducted. So it's entirely possible. But my concern is that in some of these things, a lot of time is taken. Sebi has arguably the best surveillance system in the entire set of jurisdictions which comprise IOS. The surveillance system is good. When you get to the next step from surveillance, which is investigation, and then you get to enforcement, the investigation stage, there is a lot of time that is taken. And that actually, in some sense, unless it's appropriately understood by people outside, tends to dent the confidence in the regulatory system. So it's the time taken more than the lack of any effort or looking into these matters. It's the time that worries me more than, because deterrence ought to be both quick and effective if deterrence is the order of.
I take your point that Sebi should not be conducting speculation in the marketplace. As you said, they'll probably be doing it quietly in their office. However, many people say that Sebi should have at least announced that they are inquiring into this matter. They don't have to give details. They don't have to hold a daily press conference, but they do need to reassure the market, international investors, and retail investors as well that we are inquiring. Thereafter, silence till you come up with the result. Already, NSE has put 3 Adani firms on additional surveillance. Mr. Adani himself has accepted moral responsibility, and you only accept moral responsibility if there's some wrongdoing. Otherwise, the moral issue doesn't even come up. And yet, he accepts moral responsibility, and Sebi can't even go so far as to say, we are inquiring. At least that announcement should have been made.
I think it is not the practice in Sebi to announce that we are inquiring into. this particular company or that particular group. They get information, they start working on it. And I know as a former insider of many decades ago, not many years ago, that that's the way Sebi conducts its work. So there is no practice of Sebi coming out and saying, yes, we are taking note of what is happening. We've got started on a process of investigation. That's not something Sebi does. That's not something which you find securities markets regulators doing worldwide, that they come out and say, we are looking at this. It's only when the communications to those under investigation go out, and some of that then gets into the
Can I interrupt and put this to you? There may not be a practice of Sebi or, as you say, even international regulators announcing that they're doing an investigation. But this is a very special situation. It's attracted international attention. This gentleman was at one point in time the second richest man in the world, then the third richest man in the world. He's said to dominate in many senses the image of Indian industry, even if not the reality of it. So given the special circumstances, shouldn't Sebi have set a precedent this time and said, we are investigating. When we know the outcome, we will make it public, but we want you to know the process is started. We will not reveal anything further till we reach an outcome. Shouldn't that have been a precedent set this time around?
Sebi is not concerned with individuals. Sebi is concerned with those that it regulates, which are the listed entities. The first level of regulation is with the stock exchanges. Sebi is the next level regulator. And Sebi is looking at what happened in listed entities rather than what the promoter did not do. Was he responsible? Did he act with responsibility? Far from that. Now, I think what is also diverting attention from the seriousness of the issues that ought to be addressed is the excessive focus on somebody who was the second richest or the third richest. In my mind, it's a matter of detail, whether he was the richest. The investing community, the stakeholder community ought to look at what's happening in the companies. And I'm surprised that what did they think suddenly went wrong when this report came out? And many of them are investors with excellent, shall we say, skill sets in conducting diligence, etc. They stayed invested and, and then did all of this after the report came out. So I think we must park the individual or individuals, look at what's happening within the companies. Some of them, it's an interesting thing. I was doing a little reading. There is no requirement that audit committees of the board of any company ought to have only independent directors. That's not the regulation in India. Should have a majority of independent directors. The committee should be chaired by an independent. In some of these companies, the audit committees have only independent directors. So, in some sense, I would have expected that when the shares went up, I think, what we are doing is the shares came down and now everybody is concerned. In my mind, eyebrows should have been raised and must have been. In boardrooms, we don't get to know what happens. The shares went up. It was a vertical takeoff in a sense. At that time, the kind of percentages that are out, 800%, 400%, it went. So somewhere could it be that the fizz has gone out of the cola? I don't know.
That's a very good point you're making. That eyebrows should have been raised when Adani shares, as you put it, vertically took off. I've got two more points that I want to raise with you quickly about Sebi, and then I'll come to the government's lack of response. First of all, in a letter to the present Sebi chairperson, Madhavi Butch, the Trinamool MP Mahua Moitra, who was citing information supplied by the Minister of State for Finance in Parliament, says Sebi was investigating the Adani Group in 2021 with regard to compliance with Sebi regulations. She then says that the Adani CFO has recently claimed that Sebi dismissed the charges against Adani. Mahua Moitra says Sebi has not made any of this public. Should it not be made public by Sebi?
Well, it was stated in Parliament that Sebi was investigating. So clearly, Sebi must have been investigating something. And that's what I'm saying. Till it came out in Parliament, nobody would have known that Sebi was investigating. Certainly, the general public would not have known about it. But the statement was made in Parliament. Clearly, an investigation was going on. And I want to connect this to what I said a little earlier. My concern is this was, I think, in 2021 that this was stated in Parliament. And more than a year has gone by. This is the point that I made. We should move a little faster on these matters if we assume that it has not been brought to an end. If it has been brought to an end, if there is a formal case that has been started, they mentioned that is a stage of investigation and then there is a stage of enforcement. When you find that something needs to be done, and notices are served on the entity, they come back, then the lawyers get into the business, and Sebi finally passes orders which are appealable in SAT. That stage had been reached, it would have been on the Sebi website because Sebi publishes all its orders on the website. So it's entirely possible that we are still, and I hope I'm wrong, that we're still at the investigation stage after more than a year has elapsed.
Absolutely. And this underlines the point you made earlier that deterrence works if it happens quickly and in a short time span. If the time taken is needlessly prolonged, I'm only using the word needlessly because we don't have an answer, then that undermines confidence and you're, in a sense, re-emphasizing a point you made earlier. One last question about Sebi. I'm told the Hindenburg report has also raised questions about Sebi. I'm told there are allegations of incompetence, partisanship, and even corruption. What should Sebi do about that?
I will park these three words that you used. It's easy to make these allegations. I don't know whether there is any merit or not. It's entirely possible that there could be something. But I think it's really for regulatory organizations, and I will take this opportunity to state this, to resort to capacity building, the right skill sets, the right number of people, and that, in fact, is something that regulatory organizations need. And this is perhaps a wake-up call to augment the capacity in the organization, not in terms of bringing more people, but in terms of bringing in people whose skill sets are relevant to what you need to do in a marketplace where products are getting more complex, investors are, far more than they were in the past, different expectations. Therefore, that is something, whether there is partisanship. When you say there is partisanship, I suppose there must be some evidence on the basis of which you say that, because Sebi is not going to go out there in public and say, no, we're not partisan. It's easier to take a pot shot at somebody who is not going there out in public to defend himself against allegations of corruption being made. There have been cases of corruption in the past. There has been action taken against some people on that. But then to attribute motives in the absence of evidence, I think would be unfortunate.
Okay. I understand. I'm going to take a quick break at that point, Mr. Damodaran, but when I come back, there are two critical issues I want to raise with you. The silence from the government, is that the right response from the government? And the impact of this whole scandal on India's image as an investment destination. Perhaps that last point is one that matters most to our countrymen. A quick break, and I'll be back with you. Welcome back to the second part of this exclusive interview with the former chairman of Sebi, UTI, and IDBI Bank, and the chairman of Indigo, M. Damodaran. Mr. Damodaran, let's now come to a second critical issue, which is the silence from the central government. There hasn't been a single statement from any minister. And as far as I know, the only official who's spoken is Ajay Seth, the economic secretary, who has told the Hindu, and I'm quoting him, this will play out in the market. Now, that to me suggests a lack of concern on the part of the government, because we know it will play out in the market. Nothing can stop it playing out in the market. That is the nature of the market. But if that is the response of the only official who's spoken out, doesn't it suggest a certain lack of concern?
No, I don't think it does that. You see, government does not have a direct role in this. At the end of the day, what has happened, if you take out all the hype, what has happened is that stock of some listed entities have been hit badly. They went up, as I mentioned earlier, and they have come down. Market participants will decide whether they will stay invested. Will they see this as a buying opportunity? Will they sell from the market? These are decisions which individual investors, institutional investors, will all take depending on their risk appetite. Can they remain till clarity emerges on this? Perhaps some will see an opportunity. So for the government, in fact, both for the government and the regulator, what is important is to see that there is orderly conduct in the market. It is not about the level of share prices. It is not about the indices. I was asked once that aren't you concerned that the indices took a tumble? Everybody forgot that it went up to 21,000 and there was a lot of fizz at that time. It came down to 18,000 something. I was not concerned. My point was that if the conduct in the marketplace is orderly, that's all that I am tasked to look at, not with the share prices, some individual share price gone up. And I think the response of the Secretary of Economic Affairs, when he said this will play out in the marketplace, of course, as you say rightly, it will play out in the marketplace. Where else will it play out? What he intended to say was, this is not something that is going to be influenced by government statements, directions, that's whatever you will. The government is certainly looking at it, but is not going to jump into the fray and start making comments. I think it's a measured response. They're certainly taking stock of what is happening. And so the second part of your question, you want me to address it now? What others are doing outside of the market, or I come to that?
I'll come to that in a moment, Sam, but let me put this to you. Every single paper this morning, Friday, is reporting through sources that the RBI is inquiring through banks what level of exposure they have to Adani, and the banks in some instances have already provided that information to the RBI. Now, that has been made available to papers by the RBI, even though no official has gone on record. These sources have spoken to every single newspaper. So that's a deliberate decision to let newspapers know. Similarly, should not the government have at least let it be known to Indian investors and international investors that we will do a thorough examination of the allegation of manipulation and round tripping, the allegation of bouncing up your own shares and using your own money to do so, because that is a concern that worries investors. At least on that, shouldn't the government have said, we will get to the bottom?
Well, if these are concerns that are backed by facts, and I'm sure some amount of information would have been made available to those concerned, they might have already initiated the moves to discover what the facts are. RBI has a different kind of a role. It is the banking regulator. And exposure of banks to a company or a group is something that RBI needs to look out for. I'm a little surprised, and I will take the advantage of being on your show to say this. The exposure of banks to large groups and to companies, the bigger accounts, the top 50, the top 100 accounts, information must have been available in the RBI. So for the RBI to say, let us know what your exposure is. It did, I won't say it surprised me, because maybe they want to get more information, maybe they want to get up-to-date information, but they wouldn't be having this kind of information already. We've seen statements coming out from the largest bank saying this is our exposure, public statements, and we believe that there is no risk to the system as a result. For the government, I think the government should not jump in the first instance, start making statements. In fact, we had a time when senior functionaries of the government used to explain, some years ago, used to explain any upward movement of the indices as reflecting fundamental strengths of the economy, and any downward movement as attributable to something that somebody from outside did. So we don't want that kind of statements. Government watch, and government, when necessary, where necessary, get the right kind of agencies to do the investigations. That would be enough.
Okay. Let me broaden our discussion a little at this point. Let me ask you a concern that is occurring to people, both in India and abroad. How good is India's market regulatory system? You would know because you've been chairman both of UTI and Sebi. The first reason I ask this is because of the point you made a little while earlier when you said eyebrows should have in fact raised when the shares began to take off vertically. That didn't happen in India. Everyone accepted it, was rather proud of it in some instances, made money from it perhaps as well. But that's the first point at which regulation should have woken up. So if it didn't wake up at that point, I ask the question, how good is regulation in India?
I think it is now universally acknowledged among the community of securities market regulators that Indian securities market regulation is somewhere at the top. We may not be the best. It's always work in progress. You always have to do newer things. You have to catch up. But over the years, I think it's been admitted that our regulation is certainly not inferior to what happens elsewhere. Now, occasionally, you do get some things that get the regulators back to the drawing board to look at whether what they have by way of a regulatory prescription is adequate. Do they need to do something? I don't think there would be a concern about regulatory standards in India as a result of what happened. I don't think that concern would be there. Also, one point I wanted to raise is that among the listed entities that we are talking about in this group, there are some which are joint ventures with overseas entities. They don't seem to have pulled the plug, raised questions, made statements, whatever. They've stayed invested. These are people who I imagine would have done due diligence when they came in and would be doing due diligence now also to see whether what we are seeing is what we are getting. So I think India's reputation as a investment destination will not be dented by this. I think we are far too strong and
Can
far
I
too
stop you?
resilient.
Can I stop you? I'll come to India's image as an investment destination in a moment's time. Let me ask you one more question about the quality of our regulation. This time, it's a question that is inspired by a comment made by Brian Freitas of Smart Karma. He says, and I'm quoting him, how does such a big group explain no analyst coverage and no mutual fund holdings? Now, that is a question that surely over the years, not just in the last few days, but over the years, Sebi should have been asking itself and it should have acted upon. And if Sebi didn't raise that question internally and then act upon it, doesn't that in turn raise questions about Sebi's regulatory procedures?
No, I don't think it raises questions on regulatory procedures. Why are analysts not covering, or adequate number of analysts? I'm sure some must be covering and not covering. Is a question that analysts need to ask themselves. If there's an entity that is large and you are covering that sector, would you not be looking at it? Is something that we need to. As for mutual funds do have, as I mentioned earlier, a stewardship role. They will get in only if they're entirely convinced that their investments are going to yield results. And I think the way the prices went up, clearly they must have thought this is not the time to get into these shares. We will wait till better times come and then we will get in, because when shares are going up that way, it would take a brave mutual fund to invest. A brave investor might get it. As for SEBI not being seen as doing something or the other, SEBI's surveillance system would certainly have shown movements in the stock prices. And when that happened, SEBI would have reached out to somebody to ask, why has this happened? But share prices move because investors buy. And why do they buy? Because they think that the price will get even better going forward. So you can call it irrational exuberance, you can call it by any name. The fact is that these are moved by investor behavior. And here we are seeing institutional investor behavior, especially from overseas, very credible investors in these companies. And also, you mentioned that Dow Jones has taken it off the sustainability list. Now, this is one group which, and I don't have the details, but it is doing some things in the sustainability space, whether it is green energy, whether it is solar, you name it, they are involved in some of those things. So I believe that all of us, especially those who are in responsible positions To take well-considered, mature decisions rather than suddenly say that, oh, there's something that's gone wrong. Let's also make a statement. Let's also do something
Okay.
or the other. Uh, NSE, you mentioned, NSE did what is right because if there is volatility, clearly they will say that we are moving to a segment which is intended for this. So I'm
That's
not
right.
questioning
NSE
it.
has put 3 Adani shares under
Yes,
additional
yes,
surveillance, and I believe
that's right.
the margin has
Yes.
been reduced from 10 to 5%. At 5%, I believe the circuit breakers will go up. But you made a very important point, which I'll repeat before I then talk about the impact this will have had on India as an investment destination. You say, and this is your belief, that the Sebi surveillance system would have spotted a sharp movement upwards in Adani shares, and you believe that Sebi would have reached out to people at that point for an explanation. But also, as you added, if shares are moving up and it's happening legally and properly, there is no reason to be concerned just because share prices are going up. But Sebi would nonetheless have reached out for an explanation, and they would have presumably been satisfied with that explanation, which is why they did nothing further. I think I've summed up what you said correctly, haven't I? A quick yes or no, sir.
Absolutely. I think that surveillance systems would have caught sharp upward movements as they catch sharp downward movements in share prices, unless on a daily basis it was below the level where the system would have caught it. And they would certainly have. It's not that a bunch of guys sitting there that are not concerned,
Okay.
etc. These are also people who have the best intentions of the organization, the market at heart.
All I'll say to that is I hope what you're saying is correct, and you're not just simply being comforting to those who are former colleagues of yours. I have no reason to believe the latter. So I hope
Karan, let me
you're
say,
correct, because
let
you
me
understand Sebi
say
better than
this.
all of us do.
Let
My
me say
last,
this before you get to the next question. I have never been accused of holding back on anything that I felt. So, what I'm saying is what I believe.
absolutely. And I thank you for having said it. And I thank you for having spoken so openly on all the issues we've discussed. Let me then come to the last issue, which is the impact all of this will have on India as an investment destination. Every single newspaper and TV channel and financial magazine has covered this issue extensively. What has happened to the Adani group is now known worldwide. Will it have an adverse impact on India as an investment destination? Will people turn around and say, I need to be very wary and careful because of market manipulation that is happening in India? Adani, they might say, is a company that's been exposed and revealed, but who knows what's happening elsewhere?
It's interesting you raise this. Sometimes in the past, in the distant past, we used to be told emerging market securities market regulation is substandard, and it is in the first world countries that regulation is good. And my response to them was that, and they talked about Satya at that time. My response to them was very simple, was that Enron, WorldCom, Global Crossing, Parmalat, none of that happened in India. And if it happened in markets where there was great securities market regulation, we're seeing it time and time again. Big cases suddenly blowing up, people losing money. So I don't think that somebody will single out India and say, oh, there's a problem with the regulation, there's a problem in the market. Yes, if there is market manipulation, SEBI will find it. I only hope they will find it faster if there is, or tell us there is no market manipulation if they completed the investigation process. But I don't think there will be, in the short term, there will be some hesitation on the parts of fence sitters saying, is this a time to invest in the Indian market? But I think that will go away because at the end of the day, you're investing for the future. You're investing in an economy which is arguably the one that is growing the fastest, where you're finding difficult decisions being taken both at a pace and with an intensity that hasn't happened in the past. And even as I say this, let me tell you on your show, I have no political alignments. I am not trying to talk up somebody or the other. Far from it. My point is that the numbers show, and I think the statements of people overseas show that this is the one market that seems to have some promise, at least in the medium term. So you will not see investment drying up. No, far from that. We need to, of course, tweak some other things like, rewriting some of the laws, etc., all of which is work in progress.
I note that you accept that there could be a short-term hesitation. I think those were your words, but you don't believe there will be any long-term damage done to India as an investment destination. With that in the background, let me quote the concluding sentence from yesterday's Lex column in the Financial Times. Now, the Lex column, as you know, is widely read. Yes, it's where investors are being given advice about their investment decisions. And this Lex column yesterday, the 2nd of February, was explicitly talking about the impact of the Adani scandal on India as an investment destination. And it's that last sentence I want to read to you. It says, loose capital will now favor investments in China. If that is the advice, or if that is the conclusion, it may not be advice, that Lex is giving its readership, then that is worrying, because our government is hoping that investment leaving China will come to India, or people will follow a China +1 strategy, that +1 being India. Now, if Lex is saying loose capital will now favor investments in China, that's the last advice or conclusion we wanted to hear.
That advice is something that many people might not buy into. They might see that as prompted by the events of the immediate past, the way the markets have behaved in the recent past, and certainly these shares have. But people invest, informed investors, institutional investors with a reasonable time frame for investment, invest in destinations where there is certainty that you can conduct your business, you can take your money out when you think the time is right, and where they're more comfortable with the legal systems. I think we expect on the basis of that one sentence that people will suddenly abandon India and flock to China is something that's not going to happen. I am not Karan a betting man, but if I were a betting man, I would like to take him up on.
Mr. Damodaran, I thank you for the interview you have given me. I thank you for speaking so openly and fully on all the issues I've raised, as well as for the length of time you have given for those questions to be asked and answered. And before I end, I'll point out 3 things that remained in my mind, which I think were amongst the most important things you said. I think I'm quoting you correctly. About the Hindenburg report, you said, I'm not entirely convinced that the allegations on their own amount to much. About the response from the Adani group to the Hindenburg report, you said it should have been shorter, more focused, less verbiage. They should have perhaps got professionals to help write it for them. You do not accept at all that the Hindenburg report is an attack on India. India is very strong. That was not the right response, you believe. And finally, you said, without going into the moral content of the reason why Adani withdrew its FPO, you said it sent out a positive signal to investors. And you added, finally, about retail investors, domestic institutions, and mutual funds who did not buy any share at all, that they were behaving responsibly, they were acting wisely. There's a lot more that you said, but those are the points that remain.
Just one comment. Mind.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Just one comment, which is that the withdrawal of the FPO, my statement, if I recall correctly, was that it was intended to send out a positive signal. I think you said
that you did. It's a very important correction, and I stand corrected. I'll just point it out for the audience. It was intended to send out a positive signal. Clearly, it did not succeed because the shares continued to tank the very next day. It's a very important correction. And the other interesting thing is that you did not want to comment on the claim that it was the morally correct thing to do. You put that aside deliberately, and I think people will read between the lines. I thank you, Mr. Damodaran, for this interview in particular. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you, Karan. Thank you. Pleasure talking.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.